Hello guys, welcome back to another video, and in this video we are going to answer question 1b. So question 1b, it is talking about type 2 diabetes mellitus. But before we go further, let me extend my word of gratitude to Dr. James King Koloma, who sponsored this video and made it possible for us to have this video today. Without wasting your time, let us get started. So question 1b reads, in type 2 diabetes mellitus, patients struggle with uptake of glucose into the cells. Using principles of biochemistry, outline the possible causes of this glucose uptake struggle. So in type 2 diabetes, what happens is that glucose cannot enter into the cell. Why? Because we have got insulin resistance. Sometimes we do have what we call beta cells dysfunction. So these cells, they become dysfunctional. Because we know that the beta cells is a cell that produces insulin, right? Okay. But remember what I told you in the previous video, in the first video that I made. I said that when we're talking about conditions, let's say you're writing an essay on a certain condition, always remember to start with the physiology part before you go to the pathology part. So the physiology part is where you talk about what happens normally in the normal cells. Okay? What happens in an healthy human body. So you need to talk about that in the pathology part before you start talking about the pathology itself. Because that is going to help a person, let's say a person who has never heard of type 2 diabetes. When he understands what insulin does in the normal cell, it's going to be very easy for that person to understand what lack of insulin would mean. Okay, so let us get started. We're going to talk about the pathogenesis of type 2 diabetes. So first of all, when we're talking about a condition, remember what I said, we need to start with the physiology part. So how can we light an essay? So the first thing we're going to talk about what happens when there is an elevated level of glucose in the blood. So after eating a meal rich in glucose, so you can start by saying this. So you can start by writing this. After eating a meal rich in glucose, so glucose is going to be absorbed in the small intestine. Once it is absorbed in the small intestine, it's going to enter circulation and it's going to be transported to the pancreas. So in the pancreas, we have got these cells that we call the beta cells. So the beta cells, these are the cells that produces insulin. These same cells, they have got receptors. So receptors are simply proteins that are found on the membrane of these cells. So they have got these receptors that we call the glucose receptors. So when glucose enters into circulation, it is taken to the pancreas. And in the pancreas there, it binds on the glucose receptors. Once it binds on the glucose receptors, it actually tells these beta cells to produce insulin. So once insulin is produced, it also enters circulation. And in circulation, it is taken to all tissues of the body. But in this case, most importantly, we have to talk about the myocytes as well as the adipocytes. Myocytes are simply muscle cells. Adipocytes are simply talking about fat cells. So once insulin is taken there, what happens? Remember in the first video we talked about the movement of glucose across the cell membrane. So in the muscle cells, specifically, let me just say in the muscle cells, there what happens is that insulin, it binds to the insulin receptors. And this ultimately causes these cells to express the GLUT4 transporters. And these GLUT4 transporters, remember, they are important for the transportation of glucose across the cell membrane or for the entry of glucose into the cell. So this is the physiology part. This is what happens when a person is healthy or in an unhealthy human being. But here I'm talking about type 2 diabetes. This is a condition. Okay? So since we've talked about the physiology, now we can talk about the condition. But always make sure that your work is coherent. So how can we start? So when you're talking about type 2 diabetes, we don't have to forget two things. In type 2 diabetes, we have got insulin resistance as well as beta cell dysfunction. So the beta cells, they become dysfunctional. In contrast, when we're talking about type 1 diabetes, we're talking about lack of insulin. So in type 1 diabetes, it is simply an autoimmune disease. So type 1 diabetes, it is an autoimmune disease that results in the damage of the beta cell that produces insulin. So an autoimmune disease is simply a disease that develops when your immune cells targets your own body cells and kills them. So In type 1 diabetes, there is damage to the beta cell that produces insulin. So these cells, they die and they fail to produce insulin. So in type 1 diabetes, there is no insulin production. There is lack of insulin. But in type 2 diabetes, there is insulin, but insulin is being resisted by the cell. There is what we call insulin resistance in type 2. Insulin is there. Insulin is there, but it's not working. The other thing that happens in type 2 diabetes, it's what we call beta cell dysfunction. So these cells, they stop working normally as they do, and they fail to produce enough insulin. So in type 2 diabetes, we have insulin, but it's not working its intended purpose. In type 1, there is no insulin due to damage to the what? To the beta cells. Okay, so that is a difference. But our main interest here is type 2 diabetes. Okay? So type 2 diabetes, it is actually caused by insulin resistance as well as beta cells dysfunction. So what happens if the insulin cannot work? So what will happen is that glucose cannot enter into the cells. So if glucose cannot enter into the cells, you are going to have an elevated level of glucose outside the cells, or in other words, in the blood. So that is what we call hyperglycemia. So hyperglycemia, it is simply an elevated level of glucose in the blood. Now, we need to remember that glucose, it is osmotically active. What do we mean? We mean that this particle, it draws water. So wherever it is, it will draw water. So if the glucose is outside the cell, it's going to draw water from inside the cell to the outside the cell. And that water is going to be excreted. It's going to be excreted through urine. So you find that people who are diabetic, they lose a lot of water. And at the same time, they lose a lot of glucose. So the loss of glucose in urine is what we call glucosuria. And the loss of a lot of water through urination, frequent urination, is what we are calling polyuria. So these people, they are going to be losing a lot of water through urine, and they'll become dehydrated. Okay? But the other thing that happens is that these people, they drink a lot of water. You're going to be feeling constant thirst each and every time you want to take water, each and every time you want to drink water. That's what these patients experience, the diabetic patients, because they're losing a lot of water and they want to take a lot of water. The other thing is that they're going to be very weak. So those are the symptoms that I'm talking about. So these people are going to be very weak. Why? Because glucose cannot enter into the cell. As a result, ATP cannot be produced. So ATP cannot be produced inside the cell because glucose cannot enter into the cell. So what are some of the factors that increases the risks of you developing type 2 diabetes? So the main thing, it is actually lifestyle as well as obesity. So people who are obese, they have got higher chances of developing type 2 diabetes than those who are not. So obesity has been linked actually to insulin resistance. So the more you have fats in your body, those fats are going to affect how the insulin receptors work. As a result, when insulin binds on those receptors, they cannot produce the ultimate effect that is needed, which is the expression of GLUT4 transporters. So that is very problematic. So actually the lifestyle as well. But how can we manage this condition? So this condition, we've got the drug that we call metformin. So metformin, this is a very important drug. So it stimulates this enzyme that we call the adenosine monophosphate kinase. So once it stimulates this enzyme it will undergo different processes, and at the end of the day, it's going to inhibit lipogenic enzymes. So these are simply enzymes that are involved in lipogenesis. So lipogenesis are simply talking about the formation of fats. You know that fats, they actually formed from acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA comes from glucose. So if glucose cannot enter into the cell, there is no way we can be producing fats. Okay? We can't be producing fats if glucose cannot enter into the cell because fats, they come from glucose. So the glucose that has remained inside the cell, we need to utilize it very well and efficiently for ATP production only. So we need to reserve that glucose. Instead of us wasting it for making fats, we need to reserve it. So this metformin is going to inhibit the process of converting that reserve of acetyl-CoA to form fats. So it's going to inhibit that process of lipogenesis by inhibiting this enzyme that we are calling lipogenic enzymes. The other thing that it does is that metformin actually activates GLUT4 transporters. So we have got more GLUT4 transporters and more glucose will be able to enter into the cells. So this is what I'm talking about, decreases lipogenesis. It also increases fatty acid oxidation. Okay, since we cannot have glucose into the cell, what will happen is that fat acid oxidation is going to increase. What is fat acid oxidation? So this is simply the breakdown of fats. So fats are going to be broken down so that we form acetyl-CoA, which will be used to form ATP. Okay. Then it increases basal glucose uptake. So it also increases the movement of glucose from the GIT into the secretion. What else does it do? Metformin actually activates insulin signaling. So it increases insulin-dependent glucose uptake. So it's also going to increase the activity of the insulin receptors, and that will help in the uptake of glucose into the cell. So this is a drug that is very important. Metformin enhances insulin signaling in insulin-dependent and independent pathways. Okay, so we're going to have decreased insulin resistance. So in other words, it decreases insulin resistance. That's the function of metformin. This is the main drug that is given to type 2 diabetic patients only. Okay, so metformin is given to type 2 diabetic patients and not type 1. In type 1, there is no insulin. So then the main key thing in type 1 is to give that patient insulin. But in type 2, there is insulin. So we don't have to give them insulin. We need to give them metformin that will enable the normal functioning of insulin. The other thing that we can encourage the patient to do is to exercise a lot and to lose weight, as well as to eat healthy diet. So I'm going to send notes actually. I'm going to send notes, a sample essay on this question so that you can go through it and decide how you're supposed to write an essay question.